Hello, I am talking with Dr. John Mbaku, who is a Brady Presidential Distinguished Professor of Economics and John S. Hinckley Fellow at Weber State University in Utah. He's also a non-resident senior research fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington. He's an attorney and a counselor at law licensed to practice in the Supreme Court of the state of Utah and the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah. He is a resource person for the Kenya-based African Economic Research Consortium. His research interests include public choice, constitutional political economy, sustainable development, law and development, international human rights, rights of indigenous groups, trade integration, and institutional reforms in Africa. His most recent publications include The Transition to Democratic Governance in Africa, The Continuing Struggle, Multi-Party Democracy and Political Change, Constraints to Democratization in Africa, and Governing the Nile River Basin, which I believe will be an interesting topic for our discussion today. I am pleased to have Dr. Mbaku on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with the recent developments that have occurred in Ethiopia and the ever-growing crisis in the Tigray region. Ethiopia has delayed national elections again in the midst of deadly tensions between the federal government in Addis Ababa and the regional government of Tigray in Mekelle. The head of the National Election Board, in a meeting with political parties representatives on Saturday, said the June 5th vote would be postponed, citing the need to finish printing ballots, training staffers, and compiling voter information. And the board estimated a delay of 3 weeks. The European Union recently delayed its mission and refused its request to allow the importation of communication equipment. Ethiopia replied that external observers are, quote, neither essential nor necessary to certify the credibility of an election. Is this failure to hold any election in Ethiopia undermining the legitimacy of Prime Minister Abiy's leadership in the country in good standing internationally?
Well, thank you for this question. This is a very important issue. And one of the reasons that we need to consider this very important is the fact that democracy in many countries in Africa has effectively amounted to just elections. And the reason I say that is because democracy is not just about elections and the change of government. Democracy also involves providing citizens with other civil and political rights. For example, the right of citizens to form political parties and participate in elections. That right is very important. Without that right, democracy doesn't really mean very much to citizens. So one way that citizens can participate in governance is through the formation of political parties. And what political parties do is they give citizens an opportunity to engage in a dialogue, in a conversation about issues that are very important to them. Because sometimes issues that are important to local communities are not that important to the central government. For example, issues of how to raise your children, issues associated with the rights of girls and women. Those issues are important to local communities, especially in a country where you have several ethnic groups or several ethno-linguistic groups, or what Ethiopians usually look upon as ethnic nations. So through political parties, those ethnic nations, Tigray, for example, or Oromo, for example, can express what they believe the central government should look like. If you don't allow those citizens to express those rights, you're not going to have a democratic system. Another issue has to do with the fact that democracy also involves the right of individuals, regardless of what ethnic group they belong to gather together and express themselves. For example, if individuals believe that the government is going in a direction in which they don't like, they can express themselves either through social media, through talk radio, through writing to newspapers and things. So democracy is much more than elections. That said, elections are also very important because elections allow citizens to get rid of governments that they don't like by electing them, by refusing to vote for them, and effectively throwing them out of power. So if Abiy is unwilling to schedule elections, that is frustrating to Ethiopians who are looking for an opportunity either to affirm Abiy's government by re-electing him and his political party or his political coalition, or by voting them out of government. So by not allowing elections to proceed, Abiy is basically refusing to grant Ethiopians that constitutional right to go to the polls and express themselves by either saying, we don't want you to stay in power, we are going to throw you out by electing you out, or by saying, we love what you're doing and we'll let you stay in power. So it's very important from the point of view of democracy to hold elections. Continue to give excuses not to hold elections by saying we cannot hold elections because we don't have enough money to provide for adequate procedures or to provide for adequate security to hold elections. We cannot hold elections for this and that and that and that. Is not really appropriate because it continuously frustrates people. But perhaps more importantly is that since the government's term in power has been exhausted, continuing to stay in power simply means you have an illegitimate government. Because when the Constitution says you should stay in power for this length of time, what that means is that there is a constitutional mandate on the incumbent government, the government in place, to conduct elections, either to reaffirm their stay in power or to leave power if their mandate has come to an end based on the Constitution, or if they're not re-elected. And so, what is going on in Ethiopia now is the frustration that the government is imposing on the people by simply refusing to hold elections. And by doing so, the government is unconstitutionally remaining in power because there is no mandate for the government to remain in power when the Constitution says it is time to hold elections.
Of course, the elections come in the middle of a political crisis that have stoked the debate of ethnic federalism and the right to self-autonomy of Ethiopia's major ethno-linguistic groups versus the idea that centralization of the state and subsequent relinquishment of regional authority is the best way to govern the country. Why has this argument become violent and resulted in the instability that we see across Ethiopia?
Well, the thing to do is to look at Ethiopian history. Ethiopia is actually what what political scientists and legal scholars refer to as a multi-nation, meaning that it is a nation, that is Ethiopia, made up of smaller nations. Tigray, for example, if you look at the history of Tigray, you see that the state, which is now a state within Ethiopia, has a very long history of independent existence, going back thousands of years. A very rich culture, a very rich civilization. Now, all these multi-nations, whether you're thinking of Tigray or you're thinking of Somali or Oromo, Amara, all these groups were brought together. Now, people who study Ethiopia would say they were voluntarily brought together, but there is some question as to whether they were voluntarily brought together. That is irrelevant, but the fact is they were brought together. And under the imperial government, the attempt was to forge together a supra-Ethiopian nationality. And under the imperial government, Haile Selassie, what he tried to do was to minimize ethno-linguistic attempts to have autonomy. In other words, his idea was that we would put all these groups together, regardless of whether they were independent groups before, regardless of whether they were autonomous groups before, and forge a supra-Ethiopian citizenship in which everyone, whether you were Tigray or Oromo, would become an Ethiopian. You'd consider yourself an Ethiopian. And in order to do so, he had to come up with one language, which is one of the things that other African countries were doing. Because if you look at Kenya, for example, the Kenyans had the same problem. And they eventually adopted English and eventually Swahili. But in Kenya, you see that English is their national language, the official language with Swahili, but most government is done through English. And you see the same problem in Tanzania, where Swahili is the official language. And all over Africa, many countries have that problem. In Nigeria, the groups were involuntarily brought together by the colonial government. And English was forced on the people as the national language. So what the emperor Haile Selassie did was he introduced this process of a unitary government in which one language. You might ask yourself, how did he come up with that one language? Because Ethiopia has an official language today, which was imposed on the people by the emperor. But that language did not take into consideration the languages of the various groups that were brought together, because the people of Tigray have their own language, and the people of Oromo have their own language. So it is the case with the Somali people. They have their own language, but they were forced through this consolidation by the emperor to speak one language. So for a while, that system provided some level of peaceful coexistence during the emperor. And then the Duke comes in with a new government. So the military overthrow of the emperor comes in with the Mengistu's government. They come in and they continue the process. You see, so the Duke came in and started preaching socialism and trying to take the country in a different direction. But that, in doing so, the Duke did not significantly change what the emperor had done in terms of how Ethiopia was going to be. It maintained that unitary government. But you see, after the Duke was overthrown, during the process in which all these ethnic militias, okay, like the TPLF, all these groups came together and ousted the Duke. After that, Ethiopians were at a crossroads, and the question was, what were they going to do with respect to how the different groups were going to live together peacefully? But you see, during the process, groups like the Oromo people, they were fighting for self-determination. The Eritreans were fighting for self-determination. But in the end, the only group that successfully succeeded and left Ethiopia was the Eritreans. The rest of the other groups decided to form what they referred to as ethnic federalism. The idea was that each group remaining in Ethiopia outside Eritrea, each group remaining in Ethiopia would have a significant level of autonomy to decide what to do with itself. In other words, they would have self-determination, but within a supranational state called Ethiopia. And so the federal constitution that came into being in the 90s, that federal constitution basically introduced ethnic federalism. Okay? Now, there was a problem with ethnic federalism. And that problem is the problem that a lot of other African countries have continuously faced. And that is, if you have ethnic federalism, the question is, what is going to happen to the central government? So whereas in Tigray or Oromia, whereas in those, or Somali, whereas in those ethnic states, the people who live in those states were able to govern themselves. For example, in Tigray, the people were able to govern themselves. The question was, what would happen to the national government? This, in my opinion, the mistake that Ethiopia made was that the national government became a coalition of those ethnic political parties. So the ethnic political parties constituted the national government. Unfortunately, when you have a government made up of ethnic political parties, what is going to happen is that that government would maximize the interest of the ethnic political parties that are represented in that government. And those groups that are not represented in that government would find it very difficult to participate in national governance. So throughout from the 90s, when federalism, ethnic federalism was instituted in Ethiopia, up until the present time, there was no effort by any political party in Ethiopia to come up with a national agenda. In other words, there was no political party in Ethiopia that was capable of getting membership from all ethnic groups within the country. So there was no effort to have a national agenda that appealed to all the groups within Ethiopia. The more than 40 groups that exist in Ethiopia that consider themselves to be autonomous. And so what happened is that when Abiy came into power, he started promoting, putting forth a process that threatened those ethnic states. So in other words, he wanted to return the government to the unitary system that had been introduced by Haile Selassie. And that process started threatening the autonomy that the various groups that form Ethiopia had enjoyed since the overthrow of the Derg and the institution of ethnic federalism in Ethiopia. So rather than blame the regional groups for what is happening in Ethiopia, what we need to understand is that these regional groups are simply reacting to what they believe is a threat to their autonomy. Because that autonomy is very important to those groups because it allows them to maintain their cultural values, to maintain their languages, to maintain the way they want to bring up their children, something that had been destroyed during the unitary government of both the emperor and the Derg. And so what the ethnic federalism did was it gave these people, these various groups, an opportunity to maximize values that they had tried to maximize during the period in which the emperor and the Derg were in power, but were unable to do so. And so for us, Africans, if we are looking at this very seriously, without any bias, we have to understand that you cannot get rid of ethnicity in Africa. Ethnicity is something that Africans have, and you can't blame Africans because ethnicity, I mean, when you look at countries like the UK, the English are sort of an ethnic group, or the Scottish or the Irish, those are groups that have an opportunity to maximize their own interests. The Scottish are part of the United Kingdom, but they have their own parliament and they have their own laws and they even have their own legal system, and they are allowed to maximize interests that are unique to them, but then exist within the UK. This is the same argument that if you look at Ethiopia without any bias, without any assumptions, you begin to see that the groups that are within Ethiopia want to do the same thing. And so the solution to Ethiopia's problem is for the central government to find a way to allow these groups to maximize their own interests, but at the same time, okay, at the same time, contribute to the building of that supranational Ethiopian state that Abiy and the other people want to build. It's been done. It's being done in the UK. It's been done in other countries. So why can it not be done in Ethiopia? In Sweden, for example, I mean, not Sweden, in Belgium, for example, you know that in Belgium, you have the French and you have the Flemish, and they live together peacefully, but one group, each group still maintains its own unique culture. Or you look at Canada with the Quebecois, they maintain their culture, but they're also part of Canada. And the Prime Minister of Canada is actually a Quebecois, Pierre Trudeau. Or is it Pierre or
Justin?
Justin,
Pierre is the father.
The son of, the son. So, but what I'm saying here is that Africans must understand, and Ethiopia needs to understand, that unitarianism is going to create a lot of problems for the country. And trying to impose unitarianism on a society that is made up of several ethnic groups is simply not going to work, because it's very difficult for Addis Ababa to take care of all those issues that are unique to each one of those groups. Because for one thing, the first thing you're going to have to ask yourself is, in Ethiopia today, is if you're trying to have this unitary system, okay, what happens to the issues that are very unique to each region?
Yeah, I'm interested in the analogy that you gave with the United Kingdom of different nationalities coming under the coalition or the identity of a British, what it means to be a Briton in the world.
Yes.
But sometimes in Africa, there are very serious historical splits that have encased the social fabric of society. You mentioned Ethiopia's different ethnic groups. There's other examples in Africa, for instance, in Rwanda, between the Hutus and the Tutsis, in Cameroon, between the Francophone and the Anglophones, in South Africa, where apartheid was very divisive. So what is the particular issue in Africa that is prohibiting this development from occurring with regards to self-actualization and autonomy?
Well, one problem is this, is that Africans were divided by colonialism intentionally, and Africans were brought together. If you look at Cameroon, when the Germans came to Cameroon in 1884 and started their colony, they simply brought together different ethnic groups without any consideration of in other words, they didn't ask them, how do you, for the Germans didn't take two ethnic groups and say, how do you want to relate to each other? They simply put them together and ended up with a protectorate or colony, all right? So in order to get these groups to stay together so that the Germans could exploit the resources, they introduced the German language as the official language and try to minimize the languages that these people have spoken before. Then they introduced German laws and so on and so on and so on. Now, unfortunately for Africa, what happened was that after independence, many of these countries, Nigeria, for example, Cameroon, basically took over those institutions that have been introduced by the colonialists without paying any attention to whether those institutions were appropriate for post-independence governance or not. So those institutions are the ones that are dividing these people, because those institutions were never created to bring people together peacefully. Those institutions were created in order to allow the colonialists to be able to control Africans. You see, so if you think of South Africa, the apartheid government was designed to divide Africans and keep them fighting against each other, so that the Afrikaners and their supporters could continue to reap the resources of the country for their own benefit. That is why in 1994, the South Africans felt that it was necessary for them to start all afresh and come up with institutions that were not based on race, that were not racially based, in order to bring all the groups in South Africa together. And so if you look at what was happening in South Africa in 1994, the people who were negotiating were telling South Africans, look, whether you're Zulu or Xhosa or Ndebele or some other group, we are all South Africans. We have to sit together and ask ourselves, how are we going to live together? We cannot abolish Zulus. We cannot abolish Xhosas, but we have to live together. So what we need to do is to find some a way in which we can live together peacefully. This is what Ethiopians should do, but they've never done that. They've never really sat together and asked themselves, what is the appropriate institutions that would allow us to live together and develop ourselves without preventing another person from also doing the same. You see, after all, I always tell my students that, look, you go to a university. While you are at a university, you are given a desk to sit on, to study, to pursue your studies, become a lawyer, become an economist, become a doctor. But in doing so, you don't prevent the guy sitting next to you from doing the same thing. How is that possible? Because the university has rules and regulations that make it impossible for you to prevent the other person from doing the same thing that you are doing. Both of you can do the same thing. Both of you can learn. You learn, become a lawyer. He learns, becomes a doctor, or she learns, becomes an engineer. You can do the same thing in Ethiopia, where you have a system in which if you are an Oromo or a Tigrayan, you can decide to become an engineer, and there's no reason to prevent a Somali from doing the same thing. But in order to do so that you don't have this destructive competition that you have in Ethiopia, competition is good, but the competition that you have in a lot of African countries, including Ethiopia, and that's why you have all this fighting and killing of people, is because the Ethiopians are engaging in destructive competition, not in the kind of competition that needs to mutually beneficial outcomes for everybody. Ethiopia has a lot of natural resources. There's no question about that. Those resources can be invested in human development, not just for one group versus the other, but for all groups. Think about it. Since November, the amount of resources that the central government has spent trying to subjugate the people of Tigray. If you were to take all those resources and convert them into investment in education, investment in training, imagine where Ethiopia would be. So why waste those resources fighting a war that has no meaning? Because in the end, you would have killed a lot of people unnecessarily, subjected thousands of people to starvation, okay? Destroyed a lot of infrastructure, including schools that ought to be educating people, destroyed a lot of agricultural land. And for what? So I was talking to someone on the phone from Addis Ababa, and I was asking him, in the end, what would this war have achieved? As an outside observer, just tell me one thing that the war would have achieved after it is completed. You see, he hesitated and eventually told me, Dr. Mbaku, to be honest, I'm not sure. But you see, this is what goes on in Africa all the time. They go in Rwanda, you mentioned Rwanda, almost, a little over 1 million people massacred. And the question is, for what? You see? In Nigeria, you see people killed every day, thousands of people being killed. And the question is, for what? Now, if we were to use all these resources, because killing people, going to war and killing people is very expensive. The military equipment, bullets, all those things that you're using, the wasted time, the investment that the government puts in training soldiers so they can kill their own people, all right? If you take all that money and invest it in human development, in educating people, young people, so that they can become entrepreneurs and generate wealth, the country will become extremely developed. In other words, nobody will be poor, no matter where you are in Ethiopia. Devote the money. Look at the dam. Ethiopians came together and constructed an incredible structure. Why can't they come together and do another miracle and invest in education instead of war? That is the question that we are asking. So people say, well, we have to have an army in order to prevent this and that and that and that. Most armies in Africa, in my opinion, most armies in Africa are not fighting any wars. I mean, are not fighting against someone who has come from another place and invaded the country. I mean, since Nigeria gained independence, no neighboring country has invaded Nigeria, but Nigeria spends a lot of money on the military. And it's the same, I mean, Nigeria is not alone. It's all over Africa. Countries, Spain, Cameroon, spend a huge amount of money on the military. Money that ought to be invested in education, in healthcare, in clean water, in infrastructure, so people can travel from one part of the country to another and learn how to live with each other. This is the issue. And so for me, if when I talk to Ethiopians and I tell them that, look, yes, when you have a country made out of several ethnic groups, several ethnic, ethno-linguistic groups, it's very difficult to live together, but not impossible. All what you need is a structure, institutions that can allow you to live together peacefully. And somebody says, how do you get those institutions? You get the institutions by bringing together all the relevant stakeholders, and just like the South Africans did. In 1994, a lot of people were saying there's no way South Africa can live together with Afrikaners who ill-treated them for so many years. But look at what is going on now. They still have problems, but they're living together very peacefully. You know, they have crime, they have other problems, but most of those problems have to do with the fact that the economy is not growing fast enough to meet the needs of poor people. So it's a growing thing. You see, those problems will, if you have the institutions there, those problems will eventually go away, because other countries have had those problems and they've eventually gone away because they had the institutions that allow people to live together, to compete for good. You see, good competition, not the destructive competition where in Africa, where one person believes that the only way they can get ahead is to prevent another person from getting ahead. And one way to do that is to kill the other person. The situation where if they look at your name and they discover that you're Tigranian, or they look at your name and discover that you're Somali, then you cannot get into this particular position. You see, that's what creates the problem. You need institutions that will allow everyone who lives in Ethiopia to be able to move ahead, if they're willing to. If they don't want to move ahead, that's okay. But if they want to move ahead, if they want an education, if they want to start their own business, they should be able to do so with minimum effort, with very few constraints. And one thing that I continuously tell people is that development can only take place if you allow human resources to move around freely. You see? You see here in the US, when I'm here in Utah, when we need to recruit a faculty member, we don't just look at Utah. We look at the global, not just the US. We advertise the job. If somebody applies for the job from Texas, remember, he's not from Utah. If he's from Texas and applies for the job and we interview him and he's qualified, we'll hire him, period. So he will leave Texas and come to Utah. So a shortage of skilled individuals in Utah is easily made by someone from Texas. Now, when that guy from Texas comes to Utah, we don't ask him, we don't tell him, you cannot work here because you are not an indigene of Utah. We don't do that, you see? As a result, the country develops. So what I tell Africans is that if you have a country made up of various groups, you can develop, each group can develop itself by allowing people from other groups to come into that area when they need that person. So a Tigranian doctor should be allowed to migrate to some other part of Ethiopia where they need doctors if he wants to. That would benefit that part of the country, and so on and so on. It is the only way you can move Ethiopia ahead. If you are not able to do that, the country will continue to fight against itself. In fact, for a lot of people say I'm too progressive looking at some stuff. For me, my feeling is that there's no reason why Ethiopia and Somalia and Eritrea and so on and so on and Sudan should be separate nations. What is the point? I mean, if you look at Europe, what is happening in Europe?
A conglomeration of...
Yeah, the Europeans are coming together and benefiting from each other.
Right.
You see? Because imagine what would happen if Ethiopia and Sudan were one country. Imagine the volume of trade. Ethiopians with their superior expertise, especially in certain areas of agriculture, they can benefit Sudan. You see? Sudan has its own advantages that they could grant Ethiopia by people moving back and forth. That is what I was talking to when I was talking to Egyptians. I said, look, you guys are fighting with Ethiopia over water. Sudan is, Egypt is very good in irrigation because they started irrigation hundreds of years ago. They can lend that expertise to Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a big growing country, okay? And has a lot of land that is very good for agriculture. They can grow crops and sell them to the Egyptians. And through that trade, the kind of trade that the US has with Canada, for example, or with Mexico, the two countries benefit. Ethiopia can produce electricity and sell it cheap to Sudan, to Eritrea, to Somalia, even to Egypt. That process can contribute to significant improvements in the quality of life.
Dr. Mbaku, I think what you're saying is extremely important for people to understand, especially in a region that has been wedded with conflict for so long. But one criticism or maybe a point of contention that I think is relevant are the leaders of these countries with respect to how much dominance do they want relative to the region. And I say this because the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki, he's known to exploit the regional authority of these agreements that you're talking about. How do countries collaborate? The Intergovernmental Authority of Development, IGAD, in Africa, in
Mhm.
Eastern Africa to be specific, it's joined by 8 nations, except for Eritrea in Eastern Africa. And I think one of the problems for Isaias in particular is that he cannot control that. He has no oversight because he has a domineering influence in Eritrea, where I'm from, but also in Ethiopia today, as he has made a sudden agreement with Abiy to restore peace. And some of Abiy's critics have cited his relationship with President Isaias for his increasing authoritarian behavior and the reluctance to hold the elections. And many say that history may be repeating itself, in effect, due to the political manipulation of the Eritrean dictatorship on Ethiopia government's political affairs. Is this a fair assessment to say that what is occurring in Ethiopia is due to this manipulation by Isaias or this interference by the regime?
Well, what you are saying has some merit, and that is that some of the problems that African countries have today have something to do with the nature of their leadership. Isaias has been in power in Eritrea basically since the secession and independence. And Eritrea came up in the 1990s with a lot of promise. But that promise and that potential was squandered by the dysfunctional government that exists in the country today. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that if you have a government that is dominated by a very, what we call in, what some legal scholars call an imperial presidency, that is, or a reinforced presidency, a presidency that is so powerful that even if you have separation of powers, that separation of powers is not a reality in the country. So you can have the president, you can have the executive, you can have the legislature and the judiciary. But if you have that type of reinforced presidency, the other 2 branches of government are subsumed within the executive, so that those the judiciary, which is supposed to check on the exercise of government power, cannot do so because it is controlled by the president. The legislature, which is supposed to check on the government, cannot do so because it either does not meet or it only is a rubber stamp. And so what happens in a reinforced presidency like the one you have in Eritrea is that the government, the president, becomes the decision maker in every situation that comes up. Is the head of the army, is the head of the judiciary, is the head of the legislative branch of government. That is unfortunate because under those conditions, there is no opportunity for the country to develop, because young people become frustrated when they look at their government and see that there's no way, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And so especially with very high unemployment in the country, what happens is that many young people begin to believe that the only way out is for them to leave the country. And that's probably one of the reasons why out migration from Eritrea is very, very significant. To the point where many Eritreans risk dying across the Sahara Desert by simply trying to walk, literally, walk to Libya or walk to Morocco in order to escape and go to Europe as a way to relieve a tremendous suffering that they have domestically. Now, if you have 2 of those kinds of government teaming together, so the fear among Ethiopians now is that if Abiy were to team up with Isaias, then Ethiopia would start going the same route, the same way that Eritrea has gone, and that is no development, no liberties, no political liberties, no freedom to associate with anybody, no free press, so nobody can criticize the government. significant infringement on the right of people to join social media, for example, control of the internet. And those, in other words, control of those mechanisms or those platforms that can allow individuals living within the country to even talk to each other and try to figure out what to do next in terms of trying to rescue the country from further deterioration. So Eritrea is sinking politically and economically, and a lot of young people are asking themselves, how can we rescue this country from sinking further? But they are not able to get together and discuss that because they don't have any way to do so, because the right of assembly is no longer there. The internet is controlled in such a way they cannot go on the internet and discuss those things. Radio is out, and so is TV. And you see, so that is the kind of frustration that you have. And yes, you are right. Rather, when Abiy made peace with Isaiah, many people were excited because the idea was that the fighting between Ethiopia and Eritrea was basically a complete waste of resources and a situation in which many people were being killed for absolutely no reason. And considering the fact that Ethiopians and Eritreans are actually brothers and sisters, there were a lot of people in Addis Ababa, for example, who had relatives in Asmara that they were not able to see for many years. And so when this peace deal came across, when Abiy came into power, many people were excited that this would open up opportunities for more trade between the two countries. But perhaps more importantly, there was an understanding among Eritreans abroad, Eritreans in the diaspora, that this might open up opportunities for Isaiah to see how democracy is working in Ethiopia and give him an opportunity to open Eritrea to Eritreans to more opportunities for self-actualization. But given what is going on in Ethiopia now, these Eritreans in the diaspora are saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is not what we thought would happen. What is actually happening is that Isaiah's tendency for authoritarianism is rubbing off on Abiy, and Abiy is becoming another Isaiah. And what is happening now is that the opening up that we thought would happen is not happening, and this is the fear that I hear from a lot of Eritreans in the diaspora, that the hope that they thought, the expectation that the peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea would open up the two countries to the outside world is not happening. Instead, what we are seeing is a situation in which the two leaders are basically trying to close up the two countries so that they could stay in power indefinitely.
You know, I think when people expected the peace deal to bring reform to the region, many Eritreans like myself, but also Ethiopians, were hoping that there was going to be an institution of democracy which would be practiced. But I think we see now in retrospect that Abiy was not part of the TPLF coalition, which made it possible for Isaias to make peace because he didn't have to deal with his former enemy. We saw the rhetoric previously that Isaias could not deal with Ethiopia because of the EPRDF-led government of Ethiopia, which was ruled by the coalition of Tigray, the TPLF. Mm-hmm. Now that Abiy is in power, there is a mutual understanding that the security threat to Isaias is Tigray, which is, I think, one of the motivations for Isaias to be participating in this war. And he thrives from instability. Is his continuing involvement in the armed conflict a reflection of his brutal domestic policy with regard to denying basic freedoms and allowing economic and social reform?
Well, Isaiah's And Abiy, at first, denied that the Eritreans were involved in Ethiopia, in Tigray. But by April this year, they finally acknowledged that Eritrean troops were actually in Tigray. Now, you might ask yourself, why would Eritrea, a very poor country, by any measure, is very poor, why would it devote that much by way of resources to a war that it has no place involving in? There are a lot of answers to that. But you see, one way to look at it is to understand that authoritarian governments, whether they're in Africa or somewhere else, always look for distractions. When you are Isaiah and you're having a lot of problems locally, primarily because you have not been able to open up political spaces for more participation by Eritreans. Most people in Eritrea are frustrated with the fact that since then, they gained independence in the 90s, the government has not provided significant opportunities for economic development. That's why you see the exodus from Eritrea. And one Eritrean that I met in Sweden, when I was in Sweden 2 years ago, told me that, he asked me, he said, do you know what the biggest industry in Eritrea is now? I said, no. I said, agriculture. He said, oh, no.
Military.
He said, the biggest industry in Eritrea is military, followed by
mining.
Followed by people trying to leave the country.
Oh, like trafficking.
Yeah, people who are trying to find any way. Whether he said, look, even if it means crawling on your 4 legs, you want to leave the country. And I asked him why. He said, because if you stay in the country, you know that you either end up serving, he said, if you're a young person like me, if you stay in the country, you will end up in the military and you go somewhere and be killed, or you die from starvation. And so the second biggest industry in Eritrea is people trying to leave the country. You see, so there's a lot of frustration within the country. And if you are the government, the question is, how do you cure that frustration? You either cure that frustration by going the other way and democratizing the country, okay, opening up political spaces for other people to participate, creating jobs, creating industry, providing opportunities for people to engage in productive activities. That's what you do. But you see, for Eritrea, it's very difficult to do so because the government is not willing to open up political spaces for other people to participate, for fear that if it did that, then the president will lose his position. So that one is out. Opening up the economy for more people to participate is not working because foreign investment is not going to go to Eritrea because of the instability. If you are a foreign investor, why would you want to go and invest your money in Eritrea, given the instability that exists in the country? So foreign investment is not going in, all right? And so Eritrea now depends a lot on remittances from Eritreans abroad. And so with that kind of a situation, but you see, the thing is, no matter how much you oppress people, somebody is going to fight back. It is true that you can oppress people to the point where they no longer have the capacity to fight back. But no matter how oppressive a government is, someone always fights back. Now they may not win, but so that threat, the possibility that someone may fight back, puts the government in a position in which everybody becomes a suspect. Even your top military commanders are suspects because any one of them can kill you and take over. And so one way to resolve that problem is to create a distraction. And that distraction is the war in Tigray. So the opportunity for them to go to Tigray and start fighting by demonizing the Tigrayans and calling them an enemy. But you see, this is the same group that you guys fought with against the Dirk, right? in order to get rid of Mengistu and take over and provide Eritrea with its independence. All of a sudden, these guys are now the enemy. Because by demonizing them and calling them the enemy and going there to fight them gives the government in Asmara an opportunity to say, anybody who wants reforms, you can simply say, look, how can we get engaged in reforms now? We are in the middle of our very existence, the existence of our people. You see, you're keeping your fingers crossed by lying to your people and say, look, our very existence is being threatened by these people over there that we are fighting. So we can be talking about economic development, we can be talking about democratization, we can be talking about elections, and so on. The same thing that Abiy is doing in Ethiopia by saying, how can we be talking about elections now when we have this crisis that we have to resolve in Tigray? So until we resolve this crisis, we are not able to hold elections, we are not able to democratize. So if I were Isaiah, that's what I would be saying. You see, so yes, this fighting in Tigray has a very direct connection to the ability of the regime in Asmara to survive. It's a survival tactic, which is not unique to Asmara. It's something that you see all over the continent. We can solve all these problems if we simply decide that we are not going to resort to military force to resolve problems that we can resolve by simply sitting down and talking with each other, by not demonizing the other group. All right? There's no reason for us to, if we claim to be Ethiopians, if all of us are Ethiopian, why demonize the Tigrayans? Why demonize the Somali or some other group? Why demonize them? We are all Ethiopian. And one of the interesting things, when I was in around Rwanda a couple of years ago, I was there for a conference, and I was sitting at a table dining with some fellows from Germany. And one of the Germans asked me, say, I'm not really certain, but I've been here in Rwanda for almost 3 weeks. And I still cannot tell the difference between a Hutu and a Tutsi. Said, can you tell me what the difference is? And so on the table that we were sitting, one of the guys said, I'm Tutsi. Then a young woman said, I'm Hutu. And the German turned to them and said, but I don't see any difference between the two of you. So, but you guys were willing to go to kill each other over this particular issue. But you see, so the thing that bothers me, and I talked about this all the time, is that if you go to Cameroon, you can't see two people and say one is Anglophone and one is Francophone. The only way they know is that one speaks English and the other one doesn't. Of course, nowadays a lot of Anglophones speak French. You see, so it's a colonial creation that we've decided to hang on to and use it to define ourselves and allow it to continue to determine who we are. And as a result, we are killing each other because of that. And so for me personally, if Ethiopia is going to be a nation, all Ethiopians have to be given the opportunity, the right for self-determination, regardless of whether you're Tigrayan or you're something else. Otherwise, what is the point of saying we are Ethiopian?
Isaias Afwerki, I think, has been able to manufacture conflict, not just currently, but back in the 1998 to 2000 border war against Ethiopia, specifically against Meles Zenawi. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues that people bring up when you were referring to why Tigray deserves this punishment, not to give them credence. I mean, I can't speak on their behalf, but it's because this is a revenge, so to say. But do you think this is destructive? Because the border war that we saw 20 years ago, 22 years ago now, was fought over similar transgressions, so to speak, between the two heads of government. And when the two countries are based only on the relationship between two leaders, do you think that poses a risk to destabilization because of the very delicate nature where the relationship can go into flux because of a different interest in security?
Well, you see, this is a problem that traces back to colonial period. The lack of institutions, okay, so that government is not based on personalities, but government is based on institutions. If you look at what happened in the US recently, there was a personality cult with the previous government. But you see, because the American institutions are very powerful, after that person was thrown out of power through an election, the country settled down and is moving ahead. But what happens in Africa is whenever one person leaves government, after many years, you're going to see that when Isaiah finally leaves government, okay, Eritrea is going to have a turbulent transition. And that is because during his time in power, he never gave an opportunity for other Eritreans to develop the capacity, the skills to lead the country. You're not going to see any continuity. And you see the same thing happening in Ethiopia, where you're going from, you go from one difficult period to another difficult period, because the country does not have the institutions that will allow transition to go seamlessly. So you go from one regime to another. And the change is not in personalities, you see, because the person at the head leaves, okay, but the institutions are there, you see, and the next person comes in, and really, once you have, if you have those strong institutions, it doesn't really matter who comes in, because that person coming in is not going to change anything radically, because they are not able to. But you see, in many countries in Africa, you don't have those strong institutions. What you have is a personality cult where one person decides what happens in the country. That person decides everything that happens in the country is decided by that person, not by the institutions in the country. So that if you, people often ask me, what do you mean by institutions, okay? What are you talking about? Whenever there's a new government in an African country, multinational companies are afraid of what would happen to their contracts that they gained under the previous regime. Now, if you have good institutions, businesses don't have to worry about that, because contracts are based on laws that come directly out of the Constitution. So that whoever is the government whoever is the president doesn't matter. Those contracts are still going to be maintained because of the way they were structured. But you see, the problem you have in a lot of African countries is that contracts are awarded by the presidency, and they are designed to benefit the president. So that if the president is not there, you see, there's no institution to support the contracts, because those contracts technically are not really legal contracts that were signed under some existing law. They were things that were designed by the president for his own benefit. And sometimes many of them are just word of mouth. The multinational company comes in, negotiates with the president's back man, and then they shake hands and that's it. And the guy goes on, the company goes on and start doing whatever it is it's doing. And so under those conditions, if that president were to leave power, the company will be in trouble. That's why in many instances, as the case with Cameroon, many multinational companies in Cameroon, despite what they say privately, don't want Biya to leave power, because they believe that if he leaves power, they will lose their ability to continue to function in the country. So what I'm saying here is that with respect to Ethiopia and Eritrea, what you need is to have institutions such that whoever is in power doesn't really matter, because the institutions are there. If the president misbehaves, the Supreme Court would cut him down. You see? But you don't have
checks and balances.
Yeah, you're right. You don't have checks and balances. Of course, I argued with an Ethiopian the other day telling me, oh, we have a Supreme Court, we have a legislature, and so on and so on. Yeah, on the book, you have what is supposed to be an independent judiciary. But in reality, the judiciary is not independent. The government, the executive controls the judiciary. The parliament is not independent, because parliament is supposed to be an independent institution that can check on the president, okay? And you don't have a robust civil society that can be able to oppose the president and get away with it. Remember that Charles de Gaulle, who was a very powerful French president, was literally thrown out of power by student demonstrations. Just ordinary students. You see, that's how powerful civil society is in France. And not only that, the former president of France, Sarkozy, was actually taken to court and tried by the judiciary for corruption. All right? That's what we mean by an independent judiciary. Where in Africa would you see a judiciary taking the president to court? So even though Ethiopians argue that they have a system of checks and balances, they don't, because the judiciary doesn't exercise the type of independence that an independent judiciary is really supposed to exercise. Parliament is not that independent. You don't have robust civil society. You don't have civil society organizations like newspapers, political parties. So you have political parties in Ethiopia, but the problem is those political parties are they're just ethnic organizations. Right now, there is no political party in Ethiopia that can boast of recruiting its members from all over the country. That's what we mean by a political party. So that its agenda will not be a local agenda. You see, because you look at the governing coalition in Ethiopia today, the one led by Abiy, okay, is made up of ethnic political parties. And those ethnic political parties don't have an agenda that is a reflection of all of Ethiopia. Because if it did, it would not be in Tigray fighting. Somebody asked me, how can you prove that there is no such political party in existence? I said, well, look at what is happening there. If the central government in Ethiopia was reflective of all of Ethiopia, it wouldn't be fighting in Eritrea. I mean, in Tigray. And so one of the problems you have in Ethiopia is the same problem that you have in Kenya and in several other countries. Political parties are based on ethnic groups. Ethnicity is not the way to run a political party. Why? Because it's virtually impossible in Ethiopia for someone who is not Oromo to belong to the political party that governs that particular state. Because you can't just walk from a Tigray and come to Oromo and become a member of that, and gain membership. It just won't, that's not the way the system is designed to work. But you see, that is one of the problems with ethnic federalism. Now, there's nothing wrong with ethnic federalism. It's just that it wasn't structured to work properly. Because if you want ethnic federalism to work, you have to have the central government be representative of the entire country, not just some ethnic coalition like the one that you have in Ethiopia now. That is not going to work. So how can you expect the Tigrayans to represent themselves if they are not part of the national government? Are they not part of Ethiopia? And of course, with respect to Eritrea, why would a poor country be squandering the scarce resources that it has to fight a war that really has no meaning to the rest of the people in Eritrea? That is the question that I've asked a lot of people, and many of them have not been able to answer it.
Well, I think it's for the security interest of Isaias. I think
right, and those security interests are just manufactured security interests in my
exactly, yeah.
Because the best way to have security in a country is to have a democratic system that opens up the economy and the political system for participation of all your citizens. If you do that, you would have security. I mean, look at South Africa. It's more secure now than it was during apartheid. The more inclusive your government is, the more inclusive the economy is, the more secure and the more stable the country is going to be. And the only way to do that is to open up the country so that everyone can participate. But you see, is this fear of politicians in Africa that they will not be in government forever? But you see, as you've seen with the chart, the longer you stay in government, the more paranoid you become. Because of the fear that if you leave government now, then your successor can take everything that you accumulated during the period you were in government and send you to prison. So I don't know what Isaiah, I can't read his mind, and I have no idea how he feels, but I'm sure that somewhere down the line, he is afraid that if he finally leaves government today, the young people who are going to take over government may prosecute him for crimes that he committed while he was in government. So that is probably one of the reasons why he's afraid to leave office.
Yeah, CNN recently came with an exclusive report that showed Eritrean troops disguised in Ethiopian military gear, and they were blocking critical aid in Tigray. And this was the latest in a series of reporting among international press that's come out since the war began, which have documented the war crimes the Eritrean military has committed in Tigray. And I emphasize this personally because Eritrea is a foreign entity fighting in this conflict. And as you said, it has no business getting involved in Ethiopia's affairs, which Abiy said himself was an internal political issue. He was quoted saying that. Why have these allegations not gained more international concern, considering both countries lied about the presence of Eritrean troops in the region when PM Abiy said this was simply a law enforcement operation?
Well, I saw one of the reports by CNN reporters that Eritrean troops were disguising themselves or dressing in military uniform belonging to the National Army of Ethiopia. And Eritrea denied the report, and so did Ethiopia. But there's no question about the fact that a humanitarian crisis has developed in Tigray, to the point where thousands of people have either died from hunger or have been killed by soldiers. And many children in Tigray are no longer going to school because the schools have either been destroyed or the roads are not safe for children to travel to school. So there's a very serious problem in Tigray. And the problem is going to get worse unless something is done about it. And the question that people are asking is, why is the rest of the world not doing anything about it? In terms of the international community, you might argue that there are other developments that have preoccupied the international community. For example, what is happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis may be part of the problem. The issue with COVID, the return of COVID to India, and the fear in the European Union that travelers from India may bring the COVID variant that is taking place in India into Europe. And the Biden administration that had been trying to work with Ethiopia to resolve the problem in Tigray and also the problem between Ethiopia and Egypt is now preoccupied with what is happening in the Middle East right now, and also what is happening domestically in terms of the fact that the US is struggling to to vaccinate enough people to achieve herd immunity, but a lot of people, especially conservatives locally, are fighting against vaccination. So the Biden administration has a lot of issues to deal with, and Ethiopia is just one of them. And so many people are thinking that perhaps maybe because of what is going on around the world, North Korea is coming up, the relationship between the US and China is coming up. So that might account for some of the reasons why the US has not been able to put the kind of attention that it should on what is happening in Ethiopia. If that is true, then that is unfortunate, because what is happening in Tigray is going to affect not just Ethiopia and Eritrea, but the entire region. And so it is very important for the international community to pay attention to that particular issue, regardless of what else is going on. And I think that the African Union, which up till now has not done very much to secure the peace, should become actively involved. And I had suggested in a newspaper article that I published several weeks ago, was that the African Union, working with the UN Security Council, should find a way to remove all troops from Tigray, including Ethiopian troops and Eritrean troops, and secure the peace through some kind of African Union force, so that they can find some way to begin a truth and reconciliation process for Ethiopia that would allow Ethiopia to come to grips with what happened in Tigray, so that those people who are responsible for the mass atrocities there are punished. If there are Eritrean soldiers that were involved, Eritrean politicians, including even the president of Eritrea, if they committed any crimes against humanity there, they should be allowed to suffer for them or account for them. They should be held accountable for them, because that is the only way for Ethiopia to begin to move forward. So I had mentioned that the African Union, working with the UN Security Council, should find a way to get a ceasefire in Tigray. And then after that, remove all occupation forces from the region to allow for some form of truth and reconciliation process to begin under the direct supervision of the African Union. Okay, because I don't believe that that process can go effectively if it is left to in the hands of the Ethiopians, the central government in Addis Ababa, because right now the people in Tigray probably don't trust the central government.
You mentioned the UN Security Council. They've met numerous times since the beginning of the conflict, and they've only come up with one statement, which was rather weak, diplomatically speaking, in terms of their messaging about what was happening and the involvement of the different factions in the conflict. Has the lack of a resolution or a real specific agenda shown China's interest, militarily and economically in the region to exploit Ethiopia's hegemonic status. We know China is very crucial for Ethiopia's economy in terms of foreign trade and relations. Djibouti has China's only overseas military base, and it has been the longstanding goal of Ethiopia to have sea access. What about the United States relationship, as its unilateral approach has severed ties between their ally in Ethiopia and has only strengthened the narrative that their adversary in Eritrea is trying to pull away, so to speak, from the imperialist view of outside influences trying to resolve a conflict?
Well, you see, one of the things that I always emphasize about African issues is that involving external actors. You see, when I was talking about, excuse me, about the GERD, the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, one of the arguments that I gave earlier was that Africans should be very weary of external actors like the United States, the European Union, and China. And the reason is, no matter how magnanimous those groups may appear to be, these people, when they come to Africa, are interested in maximizing their own objective. They have their own objectives. And you have to understand that in the end, the president of the United States was elected not to maximize the African objectives, not to maximize Ethiopian objectives. He was elected to maximize US objectives. So no matter what he tells you, or no matter what his representatives tell you, the interest of the United States is the US national objectives. It's the same thing with China. China is in Africa to help Chinese people, not Africans. And it's not anything, we are not saying that China is a bad person. It's not, we are not looking at China as being a bad country or anything like that, or the US as, it's just the nature of international politics. The European Union, when it comes to Africa, is interested in maximizing European Union objectives. Now, of course, the country, the US or China, is not going to come there and say, oh, we are here to maximize our objectives. They are going to come forward and tell you, talk to you about human rights, talk to you about promoting economic development, and so on and so on and so on. But in the end, if you are African, you have to understand that they are there to maximize their own objectives. And so one of the things that I've said about Ethiopia and the region is that we Africans must understand that problems in Tigray, problems in Ethiopia, problems in Eritrea can only be solved by African, by Ethiopians, by Eritreans, and by the problems. We want long-term solutions. We have to solve the problems ourselves. So if we continuously and foolishly look abroad for solutions, we are simply digging ourselves deeper and deeper into trouble. Because in the end, the Chinese are going to do what they believe is important and necessary for them. And that often may not be what is good for Ethiopia or what is good for Africa. And the Americans are going to do the same. You can see immediately that when the problem in Ethiopia began, the Americans were very concerned. But you see, as soon as the problem between the Palestinians and Israel started, they are now paying more attention over there than they are to this problem, because that is more, in their calculations, that is the Israeli Palestinian issue is more important in the US national scheme than what is going on in Ethiopia. And so for us, you see, when the Chinese became very interested in Ethiopia, and then Hong Kong happened, the Chinese considered Hong Kong to be more important to them than Ethiopia. And so that is just the way it is. So even at the United Nations, at the Security Council, because Ethiopia, China and the US have veto power, they are going to use that veto power in ways that enhance the their own worldview. And that worldview may not include improving the security situation in Ethiopia. It may not include economic development in Ethiopia. And remember, the previous administration, President Trump, when Ethiopia was struggling with Egypt, Trump supported the Egyptians. Why? Because in his calculation, the Egyptians were more important to US geopolitical interest in the region than Ethiopia. In fact, the Trump administration threatened to withdraw foreign aid from Ethiopia if Ethiopia did not sign the lopsided agreement that the Egyptians had put forward with respect to the dam. You see? So you can see there that even though Ethiopia had been an ally of the US for many years, it was not that difficult for the president to throw Ethiopia under the bus simply in order to satisfy the Egyptians. So someone asked me, why would they do that? And I gave them that the same answer I'm giving you now. And that is, Americans would do whatever is necessary to maximize American objectives, even if that means throwing a long-term ally under the bus. You see? So what does that mean for Africans? What it means is that we Africans have to realize that if we are going to promote development in the continent, if we are going to promote peaceful coexistence in the continent, if we are going to move the continent forward, that job is ours to perform, and not any external actor. Sure, we can occasionally look to the UN, all right? But when it comes to long-term solutions, when it comes to sustainable political and economic solutions to our problems, we have to look ourselves in the mirror. We are the ones to solve the problems. That's why I was emphasizing the role of the African Union. It's our own organization. Why don't we utilize it to resolve our own problems? Why look abroad, knowing that the foreigners who are coming from abroad have something in mind? They may not tell you what it is, but they have something in mind. Because these guys are not philanthropists. You see, the Chinese are not going to spend $1 billion in Ethiopia just because they love Ethiopia. They don't have enough money to throw around. So if they come to you and offer you $1 billion, you have to ask yourself, why? There's a reason. And it is unfortunate that quite often we, even including very high-ranking leaders, African leaders, don't ask those questions. Because when I was in Nigeria a couple of years ago, and people were even high-ranking politicians were all over themselves talking about how the Chinese are going to come here and transform Nigeria with benevolence. It looked to me like a joke. A country with almost 1.5 billion people that is struggling to feed all those people and move their economic conditions forward. Why would they want to come to Nigeria and spend billions and billions of dollars developing Nigeria? What for?
Yeah, I think emphasizing the need for African diplomacy is a topic which is very contentious, especially with the dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which has conflated a lot of political turmoil between Egypt and Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. Do you think both countries have the political capital and the will to resolve the issue at a bilateral level? And can they rely on the African Union as an institution to help mediate if need be? There are some critics who say that the African Union is too weak or doesn't have enough of a strong uh, continental recognition of authority to do this, but do you think Egypt and Ethiopia could do it on their own? Because it is a very important issue for both of them.
Well, I think that the role that the African Union needs to play is not one in which it will impose its will on Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. What the African Union should do is provide its resources for these three countries to negotiate. In the end, the solution to the Nile problem is the 11 countries that are part of the Nile Basin. There are 11 because there used to be 10, but there are 11 now because Sudan split into two. But right now, the issue over the short-term issue, because you can look at the short-term and the long-term. In the long-term, all 11 countries have to agree. But in the short-term, we are just looking at Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Those three countries should be able to sit together and negotiate. And the role of the African Union is to provide them with you can basically say provide them with the room to sit and negotiate. So provide them with a space to sit and negotiate. So instead of going to Cairo or going to Khartoum or going to Addis Ababa, they can meet at the African Union facilities in Addis Ababa and hammer out an agreement. Because if the agreement is not mutually beneficial, if the three countries do not agree, that agreement is not going anywhere. Because many people have argued, remember when Trump was in power, he tried to impose an agreement on those countries. Egypt supported the agreement. Egypt and Sudan supported the agreement, but the Ethiopians didn't support the agreement because they felt that it was unfair to them. So my argument has always been that the best way to move forward is for these three countries to sit together and negotiate, come up with a mutually beneficial agreement. And I don't think it's impossible to do so, because what needs to be done is for the Ethiopians to recognize Egypt's almost total dependence on the Nile River. Okay? That's the first thing that has to happen. The Ethiopians have to recognize the fact that Egypt depends on the Nile River almost exclusively for fresh water and for navigation, water for navigation, water for irrigation, water for household use, and so on and so on. All that water comes from the Nile River. So Ethiopians have to understand and appreciate that particular point. Now, on the other hand, Egyptians have to understand that more than 80%, actually more than 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River comes from the Blue Nile, from the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopia contributes more than 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River, okay? But over the years, Ethiopians have not been able to utilize any of those waters for its own development, for its own domestic development. That Egyptians must understand. So for as long as we can remember, Egyptians have used that water almost exclusively. Egyptians and Sudanese have used that water for irrigation, for generating electricity, for household use, all these years. And Ethiopia never used that water, primarily because Ethiopia did not develop the capacity to do so until recently. And since Ethiopia was primarily a rural country with very little agriculture, many people in Ethiopia didn't even bother. But now that Ethiopians have been able to develop the capacity to start tapping into that water, Egyptians are afraid that doing so would deprive them of that water. So this is where the conflict is. So we can look at some historical background. If you
1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty and the 1959 pact between Egypt and Sudan, which was what I was going to ask you. It sets up the environmental and the political circumstance for the current conflict that we see today. Why was Ethiopia not involved in the negotiations, and how did it spur this uh, need or the necessity for Egypt in particular to develop their civilizations along the Nile River? Because they, as you said previously, they're very good at irrigation techniques because of their dependency of the Nile water.
Well, the Nile River situation is very complex. If you look at some history, you see one of the things, a series of, you might say, accidents. The Civil War in the US, you see, for many years, most of the cotton, a lot of the cotton going to England, to the cotton mills in Liverpool came from the southern US, okay? Then the Civil War happened, and England was cut off from cotton that was coming from the US. And so the English had to look for another place for cotton. They went to India to grow cotton there. But the quality of the cotton there was not the kind of cotton they really wanted. Then they discovered that the Nile Valley in Egypt was a very good place to grow very superior quality cotton. And so British started growing cotton in Egypt. And one of the things that they did was the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1929, which was to secure water for that cotton. You see, that was the beginning. That treaty did not include Ethiopia. Ethiopia was not part of that treaty. Egypt signed a treaty on one side, and the British signed a treaty for its colonies like Uganda, Tanzania, and so on and so on. Britain was supposed to be representing them. Now, people have wondered why Ethiopia was never consulted during that particular process. If you talk to an Ethiopian, Ethiopians will tell you it doesn't matter. And in reality, it really doesn't. It doesn't matter why they were not consulted. All we need to know is they were not. And as a result, they were not part of that treaty. But what that treaty did was it estimated that the amount, the average annual yield of water from the Nile River was 84 billion cubic meters measured in Aswan, at Aswan, that place called Aswan, which has the Aswan High Dam. So if you measure the flow of water at that point, they found out that it was about 84 billion cubic meters. So what the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1929 did was it gave Egypt 48 billion cubic meters and gave Sudan 4 billion cubic meters. Okay? Now, so that left some water for whoever wanted to use the water. But in 1959, the Egyptians decided that since they were not able to utilize all the Nile water because according to the 1929 agreement, they were not given permission to use all the water, they needed to do so. And so that's why they came up with the 1959 bilateral agreement between themselves and the Sudanese. And so what that agreement did was it increased Egypt's allotment of that water from 48 billion to 55.5 billion, and then increased Sudan's from 4 billion to 18.5 billion. Now, if you add that, you get 74 billion total. But you see, the average flow of water is 84 billion. So 10 billion was specifically left out for evaporation, to take care of evaporation and what you call seepage. Because the idea was that some water would just evaporate into the air and some would run away into the desert. So that 10 billion was left for that purpose. okay? So in reality, no water was left for the other riparian country. No water was left for Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Congo, and of course, the country that is now called Eritrea, and so on and so on. So all these other countries, so-called upstream countries, you see, all the other countries are upstream, Sudan and Egypt are downstream. All the upstream countries that provide all the water that flows into the Nile were not left with any water, okay? Now, the second problem was that 1929 agreement also retained something that was given Egypt in 1929, and that was the Egyptians were given the power to control all construction projects on the Nile River and its tributaries. In other words, Ethiopians could not control a dam on the Blue Nile without getting permission from Egypt. So that was reinforced by the 1959 bilateral agreement. It gave Egypt authority to control the construction of any dam on the river. Now, if you look at the one thing that's very interesting about the 1959 agreement is the official title of it. Here's the official title: Agreement between the Republic of Sudan and the United Arab Republic for the full utilization. You see that? For the full utilization of the Nile waters, signed at Cairo, 8 November 1959. You see that? Full utilization. Yeah, complete utilization. So no water was left for anybody. In fact, if you read that agreement, it says that if, as a result of changes in climate, more water came up, so there was more water than the 84, okay? That's what the agreement says. Say if more water came up as a result of climate change, then the extra water would be divided equally between Egypt and Sudan. Remember, no mention of Ethiopia. Now, the 1929 agreement called those rights that were given to Egypt and Sudan, they were called Egypt's and Sudan's acquired rights. The 1959 agreement also recognized those rights, okay? And so you might say, what has that got to do with today's problem? Before I answer that, let me read a section from the 1959 agreement. This is one of the articles. It says, the acquired rights of the two republics, that's Egypt and Sudan, referred to in article, the articles are called first, second, third, so referred to in article first, as measured at Aswan, and the average of losses of over year storage of the Sud El Ali reservoir shall be deducted from this yield, and the balance shall be the net benefit, which shall be divided between the two republics. The agreement goes on to say that, but if the average yield increases, you hear that? If the average yield of water increases, the resulting net benefit from the increase shall be divided between the two republics in equal shares. In other words, no water for the other countries. Most importantly, no water for Ethiopia. You see? So what I was saying at the beginning was that Ethiopia needs to recognize Egypt's total dependence, near total dependence on the waters of the Nile. But on the other hand, Egyptians must recognize Ethiopia's contributions to waters coming into the Nile. That is where the problem is with the negotiations. Because the Egyptians have argued that the only way they are going to agree to any agreement, they are going to accept any agreement, is if before any negotiation begin, Ethiopia has to acknowledge Egypt's and Sudan's acquired rights, those rights that were given to them by the 1929 agreement and the 1959 agreement. The Egyptians call them historical rights, that those historical rights have to be recognized before any negotiation can take place. But you see, Ethiopians' argument is that if you recognize those rights, then there's nothing to negotiate, because those rights grant Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan all the waters of the Nile. So if the Ethiopians accept those rights as a starting point for negotiation, so then what is there to negotiate?
And also, the argument is that it was made during the colonial era. Ethiopia was not involved in those negotiations because of the fact that...
Right, that's the argument that Ethiopians give, in that they were not party to the negotiation. And because those two agreements are treaties, they're international treaties, which is what the Egyptians continue to say. That's why when any issue about the negotiation start, the Egyptians will say, let's go to international law. What they mean by international law is that the rights that they acquired were acquired through an international treaty, because that treaty was actually deposited at the UN, at the League of Nations, and then at the UN. So let's go back to those treaties. But the problem with that is that Ethiopia does not have to abide by those treaties, because it was not a part of those treaties. And if you are not a part of a treaty, you don't have to abide by the treaty. And so that is the problem, or that's what is preventing the three countries from coming to an agreement. Because when the last time they were trying to negotiate, the Ethiopians wanted them to have the African Union be the mediator for the negotiations. But the Egyptians said, no, we want a negotiation process that would begin by acknowledging those historical rights. And that the only way to negotiate from the Egyptian point of view is to go from those historical rights forward. But the Ethiopians are saying, no, those historical rights should not figure in any negotiation. We should start as if there is no legal regime governing the Nile. So we start from zero. Assume that those 84 billion cubic meters of water are there to be allocated to all 11 countries. Then we start from there. But you see, the Egyptians don't want that. And that's where you are not able to come to an agreement.
You know, Ethiopia has claimed that in times during the conflict that we are seeing in Tigray, that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has been an increasing security issue for them, especially because the dam is close to an international border. It's about 18-20 kilometers between the Ethiopia-Sudan border.
From the Ethiopian Sudanese border, yes.
Could there be a point where Egypt or Sudan start supporting rebel-backed groups in Ethiopia, because they have an interest in securing or destabilizing the energy profits that Ethiopia could get from the dam?
Well, you see, one of the things that you have to understand is that Ethiopia, as much as Ethiopia is fighting against itself right now, what you have to understand is that the Ethiopian dam, the God, has become a symbol of national unity in Ethiopia. It's a symbol of pride in Ethiopia. So despite the fact that the Ethiopians are fighting against themselves, but when it comes to the dam, Ethiopians are almost universally united. They see the dam as a symbol of what Ethiopians can do as a country. what Ethiopians can achieve as a country. It's an engineering marvel, and Ethiopians take credit for it. And so one of the things that I've discussed earlier is that if Egypt decides to engage in sabotage, it is not going to work in favor of the Egyptians. Why? Because all Ethiopians have to do is sabotage the Blue Nile. Remember, the Blue Nile originates at Lake Tana, originates in the Ethiopian highlands, and doesn't get into Sudan until just a few kilometers from Khartoum, all right? So if you sabotage the river in Ethiopia, what happens to the water going to the Nile? Yeah, there's no water.
It's blocked. Yeah,
it's blocked. So even if Egypt is able to, let's just assume that for assumption purposes, let's assume that the Egyptians are able to basically conquer Ethiopia, somehow do it with the help of some external groups. It still wouldn't do them any good, because you need, remember, you're talking about a river. You need an undisturbed river for the water to flow all the way into the Nile. But if you alienate Ethiopians and create a situation in which there are groups in Ethiopia that don't want the water to flow into the Nile, if you destabilize the Ethiopian government, it's not going to take rocket science for somebody to derail the flow of the water into the Nile River. It won't take that much effort. So it is to the benefit of the Ethiopians to make, the Egyptians, to make sure that there is a government in Addis Ababa that is willing to allow the water to continue to flow into the Nile. It will not benefit Egypt or Sudan to sabotage the dam. They may think that they have the military power to do so, and therefore they should do so, but it will not benefit them.
You know, the former Egyptian president, I think Anwar Sadat, he said in the 70s that the only thing that could take Egypt to war is water. Do you think now, in the era of climate change, we're starting to see one of the first big international conflicts over one of the most precious resources on Earth?
Well, the thing, as I have said before, people are fighting in Africa for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that they don't understand is that water is going to be the most important thing in Africa. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that, unlike Europe and America, water law is not very developed in Africa, okay? And you can see what is going on in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan with respect to the Nile, because water law has not yet been developed very, very well, something that is done in other countries. So what Africans should be doing now is sitting down and developing water law, how to use, you see, the Nile is an international water course, so is the Congo and the Niger, how to use those international water courses in such a way that you can achieve equity, you can achieve fairness. Because what the Ethiopians are doing, and the Egyptians, is that the Egyptians want a water allocation system that is unfair to Ethiopia. On the other hand, the Ethiopians have not yet been able to understand and appreciate the problems that Egypt has with water. So the two countries should be able to get together, or the three countries should be able to get together and negotiate peacefully and come up with a mutually beneficial arrangement. That can be done if only the Egyptians would give up this idea of historical rights, because if the only way you can look at that idea and agree with it is if you are blind and you support Egypt all the way and you don't want to listen. But if you read the book that I wrote on the Nile, and you understand the history, you come to the conclusion that the Egyptians are going about it the wrong way, okay? The GERD is a hydroelectric plant. So it should not actually interfere with the flow of water into the Nile. The only problem is that if the Ethiopians decide to fill the dam in 3 to 7 years, then there may be a problem. But if they prolong the time they are going to fill the dam, then there should be actually no problem with respect to the interruption of the flow of water into the Nile. Now, the Egyptians understand that. I think the problem that the Egyptians have, which they are not willing to admit, is that with the Nile, with the dam, the Ethiopians would have more control over water going to the Nile than they've done during the last 1,000 years. It isn't that the Egyptians really believe that the Ethiopians will starve them of water. No, I don't think they believe that. It's just a matter of political control. Because for over 1,000 years or more, 5,000 years, the Egyptians used the water of the Nile freely without being accountable to anybody. But now comes the Ethiopians and the dam. Suddenly, the Egyptians are afraid that now they may have to be accountable to someone. You see? And that is the Ethiopians. Now, on the other hand, the Ethiopians do not want to listen to the Egyptians because they are afraid that if they do, then they would be basically telling themselves that we are going to allow economic policy in Ethiopia to be dictated from Cairo. But you see, the two countries don't have to be afraid of anything if they sit down and negotiate with each other, because they can sit down and begin to realize that they can have a mutually beneficial arrangement that will benefit not just Ethiopia, but also Egypt and Sudan. There's enough water in the Nile to meet the needs of all those countries if they can come up with an agreement. Because that agreement will then provide for the management of the Nile River, not as an Ethiopian river or an Egyptian river or a Sudanese river, but a river belonging to all those 11 countries. So they can manage the river from a regional perspective. If they do so, there will be no problem.
Yeah, I think it's good for us to ask these questions in advance because it helps us develop a good framework to develop foreign policy based off of a shared interest or a shared resource, which is water, which can be very beneficial for all the countries involved. I'd like to close our interview by going back to the crisis integri that we see today. And I just wanted to ask, in Eritrea, the government agreed recently to withdraw its troops from the region, supposedly. And despite repeated promises, both at the international level and at the governmental level in the region, the regime has yet to show any evidence that they've actually removed the troops. And many multilateral institutions have been consistently asking for the Eritrean and Ethiopian government to stop blocking aid, stop extrajudicial killings, and call for an immediate ceasefire. The United States sent Special Envoy Jeffrey Feltman to the region to discuss the matter with all of the countries involved. Do you think that there are any further steps that the United States could take or any institution could use to stop the continued abuses? Yeah, that's a question for you.
Well, I think that I read reports that the Eritreans claim that they had left Tigray, and the Ethiopians also said the Eritreans had withdrawn. But given the fact that both countries had lied before, about the presence of Eritrean troops in Tigray. Most international observers are not willing to take them at their word. If they have actually withdrawn, then the Ethiopian government should allow for the next step to take place, and that is for an African Union peacekeeping force to go into Tigray and maintain a presence there, and allow for humanitarian aid to start going in, so that the reconstruction of Tigray can begin. And along those lines, some kind of truth and reconciliation process can also begin. Now, if they're not willing to do that, if they're not willing to let a neutral force like an African Union force come in, okay, or maybe some other force, I don't know, I'm not sure, I think the African Union would be the most appropriate. If they're not willing to do that, then how do we know that they've actually left? There's really no proof, because even if they show you pictures, that doesn't mean anything in terms of whether or not they've left. It's not just the Eritrean army leaving. The Ethiopian army has to leave. There has to be, the only military force that should be left behind would either be a UN force or an African Union force, a neutral force that will maintain peace in the area to allow for reconstruction to begin, and also to allow for a truth and reconciliation process to begin in the area. Once that is done, once that process is completed, then Ethiopia must recognize the fact that the only way to move forward for Ethiopia is for them to have a government of national unity, a government that represents all of Ethiopia. And that government would be the government that will be granted perhaps 3 to 5 years to reconstruct the country, so that Ethiopia can get to the point where all Ethiopians, you see, what I'm suggesting here is not just this ethnic federalism that they've had before, because ethnic federalism, the way they instituted it, is not working. And the reason it is not working is that the central government in Addis Ababa usually is made up of a coalition of ethnic groups, ethnic political parties. And those ethnic political parties are invariably going to maximize the benefits of the members of that coalition and not develop the entire country. It's just the nature of politics. Because if you are a member of that group and you don't maximize benefits going back to your own area of origin, you'll have problems, okay? So what they need to do now, well, after this peace process has worked itself up, what they need is a government that would provide an opportunity for Ethiopians to sit together and rethink their ethnic federalism. I mean, I think that ethnic federalism can work in Ethiopia, but only under conditions in which the political parties that function at the national level, just like you do in Canada. You see, the political parties that function at the national level in Canada are quite different from the political parties that function at the local level. And so the government of Quebec is completely different from the guy who is going to lead from Quebec, who leads the entire country. Because if you are Justin Trudeau, you will not have won election if all you were doing was campaigning to maximize the interests of Quebec. You had to talk about the things that you were going to do from
Saskatchewan,
Nova Scotia, Ontario, and so on and so on. You had to. That's how he won the election to be prime minister for the entire country. That's what I'm talking about. So you can have ethnic federalism where Tigray would have its own government, and maximize the benefits of those people. But anybody from Tigray who wants to become president of Ethiopia or prime minister of Ethiopia would have to come up with an agenda and a political party that appeals to all Ethiopians. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to allow for what economists call internal exit. That means if you are Ethiopian, you can move and settle in any part of Ethiopia and be allowed to participate in both government and economy in that part. So if you are Somali, you can migrate from Ogaden, from all the way to Tigray, and you'll be allowed to live there, okay? Now, if you don't understand the language there, that's your problem. If you want to live in Tigray, you have to study their language. If you cannot understand the language there, that's your problem. But you will be allowed, say you are an engineer, you will be allowed to migrate and practice your engineering in Tigray, and nobody should discriminate against you simply because you are Somali in that part of the country. Now, you see, if I'm Tigrayan, I would welcome that kind of approach because it allows me to be able to tap into expertise from other parts of Ethiopia to develop my own part of the country. This is something that Africans simply do not understand. You see, I've visited places. I remember visiting a university in northern Nigeria on a contract from the European Commission. So when I got there, the university didn't have enough professors. But in the southern part of Nigeria, where I'd been before I went to the north, there were a lot of people with PhDs driving taxis because they didn't have jobs. And so I suggested to the university in the north, why don't you hire these people to come over there and teach? They said, no, we don't want them because they are not part of us. You see, that's not a way to develop a country. The reason the US is developed, more developed than most countries, is because you have free migration. We call it free internal migration. People get educated in Utah and they move to Washington, DC, get degrees in Washington, DC, and they move to Michigan. From Michigan, they move to Alabama. That's why the country is developing, you see? Because if you need expertise, you get it from any part of the country. And the US gets expertise, not just from any part of the country, but from abroad. We hire, at my university, we hire people from Nigeria. We hire people from Australia. We hire people from India. And it doesn't bother us. They come in. The only thing is when you come here, we say you have to speak English. If you can speak English and you are willing to adjust to the culture, no problem. We hire you, you promote, you see, you are promoting our development. You're not taking jobs from anybody. You are promoting development. And by being in our midst, promoting development, you're actually you're actually helping us. So I was talking to a Nigerian who migrated from Nigeria to Utah a couple of years ago. He now runs a very big business that employs over 500 people. You see, if we had refused to admit him, look at the development that we would have given up. And so my argument is that the first thing Ethiopians have to do is, okay, you have ethnic federalism, but you see, if you want to be a national leader in Ethiopia, your political party cannot be based on ethnic groups. Your political party should be based on political and economic ideologies, okay? Then those people who govern the regional states, they can have political parties based on those regional states. Then the second thing is you have to create institutions that allow for free internal exit, allow people to move from one part of the country to another. That way, you don't see people in Addis Ababa, where you have all these people in Addis Ababa who are highly educated, but they are underemployed because there are not enough jobs. But they cannot go to other parts of Ethiopia to get jobs because they are afraid that when they go there, people will say, you are not a son of the soil. You are not a member of this group. Go away, you see? And you see that problem in Nigeria. You see it in Kenya. You see it in Cameroon. You see it in almost every African country where people cannot go to where the jobs are because when they get there, they say, hey, you are not a son of the soil. You don't belong here. The country is not developed. Entrepreneurs, you see, cannot start businesses. So all businesses are concentrated in Addis Ababa. And the same thing you see in Nigeria. Businesses concentrated in Lagos, in the urban areas and the rural areas, no businesses because people cannot go to the rural areas because of this problem with internal migration. So for Ethiopia, this is a suggestion that I've been making all along. You can have your ethnic federalism, but you should adjust it to allow for internal migration and abolish ethnic political parties at the national level. Because those ethnic coalitions, like you see in Kenya, that is the reason why you have all this post-election violence in Kenya. Because whenever somebody gets elected in Kenya, the ethnic group where the person comes from claims the government for themselves, and the rest of the country is locked out. The same thing you've seen in Ethiopia. And so this is, and of course, the next thing that I would like for Ethiopians to do, and this is what I've been preaching throughout Africa, instead of fighting the Eritreans, Ethiopians should actually open up the border and eventually get rid of this Ethiopia-Eritrean nonsense. Start forming a union. I don't see why Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, why they cannot be one trading group. Imagine how powerful that group would be in international negotiations, where Ethiopia goes out to negotiate foreign investment. They are just Ethiopia alone. But imagine what would happen if Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti, if these countries as a group were negotiating with the Chinese, they would gain more benefits from that negotiation than when Ethiopia is negotiating alone.
I think that goes to competent governments being in these countries for it to allow stability and prosperity to come into these countries. When you have IGAD running these sort of negotiations you're talking about, I think there has to be competent governments or governments that are allowing the citizenry to participate gainfully in the government to allow for this trade unions or pacts to really take effect.
Well, that's where you need visionary leadership. You see, you need visionary leadership, the kind of leadership that will come into government and allow the people to construct these institutions that I'm talking about. Because if you have institutions in a country, you see, look at South Africa. The former president, what was his name? The Zulu fellow. The former president of South Africa. Zuma. You see, Zuma fought that. I mean, Zuma was a great man. He fought against apartheid many, many years. But his government became dysfunctional. And what happened? The institutions kicked him out. He was gone. So the next guy is making the same mistakes. Ramaphosa is making a lot of mistakes. But you see, his government is being threatened. And the reason his government is being threatened is because you have the institutions there. You have news, you have a very good press is criticizing him. Civil society is criticizing him, okay? Threatening to take him to court. And they have a very good independent judiciary in South Africa. And so what I'm saying is that if you have that system in Ethiopia, it will not be possible for one person to do what is being done in Eritrea now, or what Abiy is doing in Ethiopia. The reason those people are able to do that and get away with it is because you don't have the types of institutions that I'm talking about here. I mean, civil society in Ethiopia is not very robust, and so cannot criticize. It's very difficult for civil society in Ethiopia to criticize the prime minister and get away with it, because government will not allow it. But if you have the institutions that I'm talking about, then no matter how hard the government tries, it will not be able to succeed in suppressing public opinion and doing so for long. Now, they may try, but they're not going to succeed. Now, there are a few governments in Africa where, I mean, look at Ghana, for example. The government tried to pull a fast one on the Ghanaians and ended up not being able to succeed. But the reason is because of the fact that once people test their democratic system and find out how well it is working, it's very difficult to go back. The reason people are able to do what they're doing now is because the people have not yet developed the democratic culture to be able. Governments are not as powerful as they think they are. Most of the power that governments have is just what you might call, you could call it fake power, if you want to, for the lack of a word to express it. Because people think governments are very powerful, but they are not really very powerful.
It's projected.
Yes, because if your power is basically the gun and the military, that's not really that much. It's not that much in terms of power. Militaries collapse, and we've seen them collapse before. So a powerful government is a government that has not military power, but a government that is democratic, allows the citizens to participate, grants citizens civil and political rights, and provides its citizens with an opportunity for self-actualization. People can go to school and develop the skills that they need to become productive adults. So people are busy creating wealth. I mean, think about it. In the US, you don't become rich by going to government. Going to government is a sacrifice. You get rich here in the US by staying in the private sector and creating your own wealth. So two guys working in their dormitory at the college develop YouTube and become billionaires overnight. You see, that's how you make money. But in Africa, you make money by going to government. And you go into government and then you steal. You see, so you're not creating wealth, you're just stealing the money that is being paid to you by multinational companies that are in the country exploiting the natural resources that are meant to develop the country, bribing you and so on and so on. You're not creating anything. So you can be in, I mean, look at, what is his name? Deby was in power for more than 30 years. And Chad is poorer today than it was when he came into power. Biya has been in power for more than 40 years. And Cameroon is still very poor, even though Cameroon is one of the biggest oil exporters and an exporter of wood in the world. Poverty is still extreme poverty, you see? So giving that, this is what I tell African politicians, granting people the opportunity to develop themselves makes your government a strong government, not a weak government. Governments that people who stay in power by oppressing their citizens, killing them, brutalizing them, starving them to death. They think they are powerful, but they are not. They are very weak. And I was writing a letter to the politicians in South Sudan, and the question I asked them was, how do you want history to remember you? Do you want history to remember you as individuals who spend years in government brutalizing their own people and driving them into poverty, or progressive leaders who use their opportunity in government to provide opportunities for citizens to develop themselves, to get an education, especially girls, to get an education and develop the skills to allow them to become productive citizens? You have to make that decision for yourself. So if you had an opportunity to talk to Isaiah, that's the question you should be asking him. How do you want history to remember you? Like Mobutu?
No.
I mean, Mobutu was in power from 1965 to 1997 and had all the authority to change the country. But look at what happened. I mean, if you talk to Congolese today, except for the few guys who benefited under his regime, most Congolese don't consider him as someone who did anything good for the country, because he didn't. So that's where we are now, you see, with respect to what is going on in Ethiopia.
Having said all of this about GERD, about the Tigray conflict, about political manipulation, for Eritreans specifically, because this is my target audience, who are watching this video, what would you suggest for them after the regime in Asmara falls to develop the civil institutions, the government, which would allow prosperity to occur in the country? Because we have never really been able to have the opportunity for state building, which I think is a very unique and rare event. I think it could reflect the current and projected future reality of the region, as you cited. What do you suggest for Eritreans to learn from all of the other experiences from various African governments and the historical precedent that's been set?
What I would suggest for Eritreans is that they should pay a lot of attention to institutions and pay very little attention to personalities. You can rule a country very well with a group by a group of thieves. So a group of thieves can rule a country very well if you have good institutions. Because what institutions do is they prevent people from being selfish. You see, here in the US, you go into government and you try to benefit only yourself. Then in the next election, they'll kick you out, or they will drag you into court and throw you out, and you are finished. That's why most politicians in the US don't go in that direction. The reason politicians in Africa, including Isaiah in Eritrea, behave the way they do is because there are no institutions to prevent them from doing so. So one of the things that economics has taught me is that assume that the person you are electing as your leader is going to be opportunistic. If he comes to you claiming that he's a religious person, he has taken a vow of poverty, don't believe him. Assume that he is going to be bad. Given the opportunity, when he gets into power, he's going to misuse his power. Make that assumption. Assume right from the beginning that when this guy takes over the power, you give him the one as the president. This guy immediately will become opportunistic and start engaging in activities that are corrupt, in activities that will make him more powerful, activities that would generate money for his family and his friends. Make that assumption. Once you make that assumption, that's what the founding fathers of the American Republic, that was their assumption. The assumption was that the politician who is given power will behave opportunistically and use that power to the detriment of the country. That's what they assume. Once you make that assumption, then the next question you ask yourselves, how can we constrain this guy? How can we guard this guy to prevent him or her from abusing his power? Okay? Then you put together a structure that would prevent any evil person, because you don't know what is in the heart of a person. I can come up to you and say, I would never do so and so, but you have no idea. You see, I could actually come out of a monastery or from a seminary, from a church, where I've taken the vow of poverty and tell you, look, I would never do anything to harm the country. Isn't that what politicians say when they're campaigning for office? That's what they say. But you see, how do you know that the person is telling you the truth? Now, this person may actually be telling you the truth, but the problem is people don't know how they are going to behave once they get power. The guy may be honest. He may really be honest and does not intend to do bad things. But you see, the problem is we don't know how people behave when they have power. Because I've seen instances in which very good people, very humble people, once they get power, something happens to them that they have no idea what it is. They start behaving differently. You see? So that's what the founding fathers of the American Republic were looking at back in the 1700s. And so what they decided was that the best thing to do is don't trust your fellow man. Don't trust your fellow man, okay? Don't. Even if that guy is your father, don't trust him. What you need to do is, if you're going to put him in a position of power, put all the checks and balances around him, all the constraints, so that if it turns out that this guy is an angel, you see, if you look at the Federalist paper, Madison said if men were angels, then you wouldn't need constraints. You wouldn't need checks and balances. But men are not angels. Therefore, construct your government in such a way that if that angel, that person claiming to be an angel, if it turns out to be the devil, you're covered. There's no problem, because he cannot exercise his devilish activities. If he tries to, the system will constrain him, will prevent him from doing so. That's what Eritreans should sit down. And this process is something that you have to be deliberate. You can't just go and take the constitution from some place and put it in Ethiopia, Eritrea. No, you have to sit down and take your time. I believe that the best way to do this is to take at least 3 years and talk about it. Look at the Eritrean history, look at the Eritrean experience, and so on and so on. And try to plug all the loopholes and come up with an institutional structure that would make it possible for the people of Eritrea to prevent anyone, it doesn't matter who it is, that goes into government from becoming opportunistic and trying to stay there forever. It can be done. It's been done in a lot of countries. So you have an independent judiciary, a really independent judiciary. You have an independent legislature, normally 2 houses, one opposing the other. One has a veto over the policies of the other, okay? So one guards the other. But then the 2 of them guard the president. They can throw out the president by impeaching the president, all right? And then you have a judiciary that is capable of throwing out any one of them, and so on and so on. Then, not only that, you have robust civil society that is educated, very politically active, and with their eyes open, you see, so that when somebody powerful does something, civil society will dig it up and expose it. And then the courts will take over and throw that guy in jail. I mean, look at what happened in France. The former president was convicted. You see, so those kinds of things. Once you establish a government like that, you begin to develop a democratic culture. And you might say, why is the democratic culture important? It is important because the system can only work if the majority of people buy into it. One of the problems you have in Africa is that only a small group of people are obeying the law. The majority of the people don't obey the law. So the police cannot enforce the law because so many people are breaking the law, it becomes impossible. But you see, here in the US, most people obey the law, even if there's no police officer around to tell them to do so. They just do it because they believe that it is to their best interest to do it. You see, because if the community becomes lawless, they are the ones to suffer. Their property values will go down. Their cars get broken in. They cannot enjoy their worth. Americans understand that. That's why most Americans voluntarily obey the law. And so the police can then zero in on that small number that does not obey the law. And so in Eritrea, the development of a democratic culture, you see, is that process in which most Eritreans begin to obey the law, even though there's no police officer around to force them to do so. Most Eritreans begin to report someone who breaks the law because they know the law is their own. You see, when you have the law imposed from, because I mean, if you go to Eritrea, as it is in a lot of other African countries, people don't even know what a constitution is because that was never discussed. People don't talk about it. The government in Asmara probably threw the constitution away many years ago and don't even care about it, you see? So one thing that happens when you go through this reconstruction slowly, involving everybody, is that people come to understand that the law belongs to them, not to the government. The law is theirs. The country is their country, not the government. That the wealth in the country belongs to them, not to the government. That there is no such thing as government money. The government doesn't have any money. The money belongs to the people of Eritrea. They voluntarily give some of it to the government in the form of taxes for the government to do certain things to them. The government is a servant, you see. They surrender some of their rights to the government so that the government could do certain things for them. But the government is not allowed to do anything that the people didn't ask them to do. That's the idea of developing a democratic culture. So every time the government misbehaves, people get up and say, wait a minute, you can't do that. Because the system you have there now is one in which the government is the master and the people are the servant. The opposite. You see, the government is supposed to be the servant and the people are the master. And the government governs based on the concern of the people. And so elections become an instrument through which the people can throw the government out if they are not satisfied. We call it in West Africa, you sack the government. If you believe that the government is not doing what they're supposed to do, an election comes up, you sack the guy and put in someone else. So since the government knows that in advance it can be sacked, the government usually doesn't misbehave for fear that if it misbehaves, it will be sacked.
Dr. John Mbaku, we've discussed so many topics today. I would like to give you the last word.
Okay, with respect to the good, I think that there are there's long-term and there's short-term. For the long-term, all 11 countries have to sit together and negotiate how they want the Nile River Basin to be managed, the resources of the Nile River Basin to be managed. That's the long-term. They have to come up with a legal framework that is acceptable to all 11 countries. In the short term, however, Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia have to sit down and come up with an agreement for managing the good. That agreement must keep in mind, number one, the fact that Egypt depends almost totally on the Nile River for water. On the other hand, they also have to keep in mind the fact that most of that water comes from Ethiopia, and that Ethiopia has to be given an opportunity to enjoy its fair share of the water for its own local development. If these three countries are willing to accept that, then the next step for them to go to is that the so-called historical rights that were granted Egypt and Sudan through those two agreements, the 1929 agreement and the 1959 agreement, must not be allowed to be part of the negotiation, because if they are part of the negotiation, these three countries will never come to an agreement, because Ethiopia would not accept giving up all its rights to the use of the waters of the Nile to Sudan and Egypt, because that's what those agreements do. So in order for them to move forward in the short term, they have to recognize those things and then come up with an agreement that is mutually beneficial. Now, the GERD is a very important hydroelectric plant. It's supposed to provide, to generate over 6,000 kilowatts of electricity, more electricity than Ethiopia can ever use. And some of that electricity can be sold to neighboring countries, including Sudan, for development, especially in the rural areas, because rural electrification can actually change economic development in those areas significantly. And so the GERD is going to be beneficial, not just for Ethiopia, but also for all the other countries. Perhaps more importantly is that the GERD can help regulate water flow in the Nile, especially during the rainy season, when they tend to have a lot of floods in the region. So since the GERD can regulate the flow of water into the Nile and prevent floods, especially in Sudan, the three countries should see the GERD as something beneficial to them. One thing that I would also suggest the three countries do is improve relationships between the three of them. They should stop demonizing each other. The Ethiopians should stop demonizing Egypt and Sudan, and the Egyptians and the Sudanese should stop demonizing the Ethiopians. They should be able to live together peacefully, because the boundaries between them were established by colonialism. For all we know, if you look at the boundary between Sudan and Egypt, most of the people on the boundary are the same people. You see, so and the same thing in Sudan. Remember, Sudan and Egypt used to be one country under the British. So this idea of boundaries and so on is an artificial thing, and I don't understand why these three countries cannot understand that and begin to live together peacefully. Now, with respect to Eritrea, the people of Eritrea, with respect to Tigray, I don't understand why the Eritreans are fighting in Tigray. It's a fruitless exercise, one that is being done for the sole purpose of keeping one person in power, and which in the end would not benefit the people of Eritrea. To think about it, look at the boundary between Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray. Those boundaries are artificial. Who is to say for a fact that the people in Tigray don't have any relationship with the people in Eritrea? Who is to say? So why are they fighting and killing each other? Why can't they use those resources for development, given the level of poverty that you have in Eritrea today? Those resources that are being squandered on the military, why can't they use those resources for development? I don't really see, if I were giving advice to the people of Eritrea, I'll tell them, get rid of the army. Why are you spending money on the army? What is the use of the army? Why not just have a police force that enforces local laws and forget about the army? Who are you fighting? You have a peace agreement with Ethiopia. And I'll tell the same thing to Ethiopia. Why do you need an army? You are no longer going to fight Eritrea. So what are you doing with an army? Use the resources for development. We Africans have to learn from the Americans and the Europeans. Let's put our resources, let's invest in our people, in our girls, in our boys, and forget all these investments. Buy military equipment. I mean, you buy an anti-tank missile from abroad for $10 million and $10 million, $30 million. And what do? You fire it once, and that's it. Imagine squandering $10 million in one instance to destroy a series of buildings and kill a couple of people. Imagine what 10 million would do if you were to invest it in rural education. The development coming out of there is enormous. You wouldn't have all these Eritreans dying in the desert trying to cross the desert into Morocco or into Libya, or dying on the high seas trying to reach Italy. I talked to some Eritreans in Sweden, and they told me they really didn't want to go to Sweden because Sweden is very cold. But they had no choice. So I asked them, if you have your choice today, would you go back to Asmara? Say, yes, I'll go back to Asmara tomorrow if the government change and situations improve. So development is the key to stability in these places. Eritreans are very entrepreneurial people. I mean, look at them in Atlanta, in Los Angeles, in Minneapolis. Eritreans are very entrepreneurial. So if you were to create an environment in Eritrea, the government will not even have to create jobs. Those people will create jobs for themselves. So that is what you need in the country. So for my final advice to Eritreans is that when the opportunity comes, okay, don't make the mistake that was made in 1995. What you need to do is sit down and amongst yourself, create a government that would make it very difficult for any individual in power to act above the law, and create the conditions that have underdeveloped the country for the last nearly 30 years. Can that be done? Yes, it can be done because it's been done before. You only have to have the willpower to be able to do it. Don't have this thing where you'll have an opportunity and someone will rush in from some place, from Los Angeles or Minneapolis or someplace, and then set himself up as a new dictator. Don't do that. Use that opportunity. Don't make the mistake that South Sudan has continued to make all these years. It had an opportunity in 2011 to create a government. It failed to do it, and look at where they are now. And as I told them when I was there, it's going to continue to happen. If they don't listen and bring everybody together and create that government that we are talking about, the government where no one individual is more important than any other individual, then once you create that government, you can begin to develop the democratic culture. You see, gradually. People will come to realize that the fact that your friend is getting rich doesn't mean you can't get rich. You don't have to be angry because your friend is getting rich. You too can become rich. You don't have to get angry because that guy from a different ethnic group is getting rich. because you too can get rich, you see? And so on and so on and so on. That is how you develop a country. And stop looking abroad, because those people abroad are not going to solve your problem. They have no reason to. They have no interest. The more you remain underdeveloped, the better it is for them, because then they can come and give you some trinkets, and while you are busy consuming those trinkets, they are digging up and taking your natural resources and taking them over to develop their own country. And that is what is happening in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Foreign companies all over, Chinese companies, American companies, companies from Israel, companies from the Middle East, they are there digging up all those resources. And what is happening to Congolese? They are starving on the streets because their government, instead of looking inward, like I'm saying Eritreans should do, instead of looking inwards and asking themselves, where are the institutions that will allow us, Eritrea, to develop our own country? That's what we need. We need to establish those institutions. Congolese are running around the world looking for people to help them. And those people are not helping them.
Dr. John Mbaku, I would like to thank you for spending time with me to discuss these very important issues.
Thank you. I'm very passionate about development in Africa, all Africa. You see, I'm one of those people who don't talk about sub-Saharan Africa. I never use that expression. I talk about Africa, all the way from Morocco, from Cairo to Cape Town. I'm very passionate about development. And I believe that what we Africans, especially those of us who live in the diaspora, need to do is start encouraging Africans to begin to realize that African development can only be achieved through the efforts of Africans, not by anybody else. Nobody is going to help us. And in the last 500 years, we should begin to realize that nobody is going to help us. We are the only ones who can help ourselves. And we can do so by beginning to construct the institutions that would allow us to help each other develop. That is where. So for us, as I said on one of my other interviews, if Eritrea is suffering, if Tigray is suffering, we, all Africans, are suffering. We can't just look at Tigray, Eritrea, and ignore those places because we come from South Africa or we come from Nigeria and it's not happening to us. That is not the way to look at it. If one part of Africa is suffering, the whole continent is suffering.
Thank you for your words of wisdom. I appreciate spending your time again to discuss these important topics which are relevant today. And I hope that this information and this insight gets out to as many people as possible. Thank you.
I thank you for giving me the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. I believe that these forums that we are using to discuss African problems, we need to utilize them more, because the only way we are going to move ahead in Africa is if we begin to talk about these issues so that people can understand and appreciate that there are answers out there. And that this situation is not as hopeless as our foreign partners continue to tell us they are. They are not as hopeless. There are solutions right there. We only need to reach out and grab them. Okay.
And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for watching. And John Mbaku, you are welcome back anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.